Hi again, everyone. So next up is our first panel, which is the capacity of international organizations to respond to crises. And this panel is moderated by Georgetown law professor Anupam Chander, an expert on the global regulation of new technologies and the author of The Electronic Silk Road. Professor Chander clerked for Chief Judge John O. Newman of the Second Circuit and Judge William A. Norris of the Ninth Circuit. He has practiced law in New York and Hong Kong with Cleary Gottlieb and is a recipient of the Google Research Awards and an Andrew Mellon Grant on surveillance. Professor Chander has served as a consultant to the World Bank and World Economic Forum. Also on our panel, we have Rhoda Weeks Brown, General Counsel and Director of the IMF's Legal Department. She advises the IMF's Executive Board, management, staff, and country membership on all legal aspects of the IMF's operations. She also served as Deputy Director in the IMF's Communications Department, leading its communications and outreach in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Ms. Weeks Brown has a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA in Economics, summa cum laude from Howard University. She is a member of the Committee on International Monetary Law of the International Law Association and of the Consultative Group for the Sovereign Debt Forum. She serves on the boards of two nonprofit organizations, Talentnomics Inc. and Results for America. Ms. Weeks Brown was named one of the top 27 Global General Counsels 2020 by the Financial Times and one of the top 5 general counsels in the area of promoting ethical standards. Next up is Masoud Ahmed, president of the Center for Global Development. He joined the center in 2017, capping a 35-year career driving economic development policy initiatives related to debt, aid effectiveness, trade, and global economic prospects at major international institutions. Mr. Ahmed joined CGD from the IMF, where he served for 8 years as Director, Middle East and Central Asia Department. In that role, he oversaw the fund's operations in 32 countries, and managed relationships with key policymakers and stakeholders. From 2003 to 2006, Mr. Ahmed served as Director General, Policy and International at the UK government's Department for International Development. Mr. Ahmed also worked at the World Bank from 1979 to 2000 in various managerial and economic positions, rising to become Vice President, Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. We also have Professor Eyal Benvenisti, the Wewell Professor of International Law and the Director of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law at Cambridge University. Professor Benvenisti was Project Director for the Global Trust Sovereigns as Trustees of Humanity Research Project, funded by the ERC Advanced Grant. He is also the recipient of several prizes, including the Humboldt Research Award and the Francis Deak Prize. He is a co-editor of the British Yearbook of International Law. He was on the editorial board of the American Journal of International Law and International Law and Domestic Courts. He is also a member of the Israeli Academy for Sciences and Humanities. And also joining us momentarily is Stephen Solomon. He is the principal legal officer at the World Health Organization. Prior to joining the WHO, Mr. Solomon served as deputy legal counselor at the United States Mission to United Nations organizations in Geneva, negotiating a wide variety of human rights and humanitarian law instruments. He was an attorney with the State Department for several years before that, and a leading participant in negotiations related to anti-personnel landmines, the protection of cultural property during armed conflict, and the International Criminal Court. After law school and a stint in private practice, he was a lawyer for the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and has also worked on Capitol Hill. And now I'll be passing things off to Professor Chander. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christina, and congratulations to the Georgetown Journal of International Law for assembling such an incredible symposium today and tomorrow. And I am honored to have the opportunity to have a conversation with these incredible panelists, these incredible experts that Christina just described. So the way that we're going to proceed is that I will ask a couple questions that are designed to elicit kind of comments from the entire group, and I'll go in seriatim. And then I will ask a specific question to each of the panelists. And then we'll have time for Q&A from the audience. So I encourage you to submit questions, and there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, as you are all by now quite familiar. So let me begin with my first question. So as Professor Sean Hagan and Dean Traynor argued this morning, the last year has shown yet again the importance of international organizations, because crises that we face are fundamentally international, from the pandemic to the refugee crisis to financial crises and to global trade. What were some of the successes of international organizations that help us understand their role in the international system? And what were some of the key actions taken by your own organization if you are at one of these organizations? So let me begin by turning to Ms. Rhoda Weeks-Brown of the IMF.
Thank you so very much, Anupam. Thanks to you and the Journal and Georgetown for inviting us to be here today. It's an honor to be with you and distinguished panelists and all in this audience. If there was any remaining doubt, I think, out there about how truly interconnected we are, I think this pandemic and this crisis have laid those doubts to rest, because it's clear that our societies and our economies are only as healthy as the most vulnerable components thereof. As a corollary of this, I think this crisis has also shown beyond doubt the absolute criticality of global cooperation and multilateral action to address these sort of global problems. We need global solutions for such problems. And so international organizations like mine needed to act quickly and decisively. And I think for the most part, we've been doing that, supported, of course, by our respective member countries in what I would call a true spirit of multilateralism. And certain at the fund, our response has been strong. It's been unprecedented. Never in the history of the IMF have we moved so quickly and done so much. But once we're faced with this health and economic crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before, it would take quite a long time for me to summarize everything we've done in responding to this unprecedented crisis. We had to change everything from the way we operated, virtual board meetings, staff working from certain locations, expediting how we did our procedures. So there's a very long list. I'll try to focus maybe just on two areas: the IMF's financing role and some of the key areas of our policy advice. And I'll try to be as brief as I can, but of course, happy to answer questions. But with respect to our financial support in response to the desperate financing needs of our membership that this pandemic created, we moved very quickly. We first made a number of changes to facilitate emergency financing, sort of very rapid emergency financing to our membership. Starting first with doubling the access limits for that financing, so we're able to provide more. And then with this expanded access limits, we provided so far over $110 billion in new financing to 86 of our member countries. Most of this new financing has been in the form of, again, what we call emergency financing, which is rapid outright disbursements, not linked to ex post conditionality of the kind you normally see in IMF lending. To put this 110 billion to 86 countries in perspective, in sub-Saharan Africa, IMF financing last year alone was about 13 times more than the annual average over the previous decade. A second thing we did was related to debt relief for the 29 most vulnerable members in our membership. And there we had to first, again, change the instruments that we had. So we had an existing debt relief trust, but we had to update that instrument to make it applicable in the pandemic. I won't get into all the details, but we made that change to the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust and then drew on that. So far, we've provided $740 million to these 29 most vulnerable members. And we have another tranche that we would expect to disburse in the next few months, bringing that total to about $1 billion. And again, putting that broader in perspective, IMF lending and debt relief during the time of the global financial crisis the high was to 27 countries. Now we have a new high of 115 countries that we provided this combined financing and debt relief. Third example, we created a new lending facility with very innovative features, the short-term liquidity line. Again, the main point I want to make there is that was a proposal we had considered just a few years before, but the membership at that time was not ready to approve it. again, in this spirit of multilateralism I talked about earlier, in the sense that we want to put everything on the table that might be useful for members, the membership came together and was able to approve that. The fourth thing I'll mention is not financing, of course, in the sense of the fund's normal lending, but it is special drawing rights. And as you would have heard in all the discussions over the last couple of weeks, IMF executive directors have now expressed broad support for a new general allocation of SDRs in the amount of 650, the SDR equivalent of 650 US dollars. It hasn't been approved yet, but the current understanding is our managing director will make a proposal to our executive board in the next few months. And we would hope that sometime around August or so that allocation would be approved. This would be the creation of a new reserve asset that would be distributed to all IMF member countries. It would benefit all members. It would increase the global supply of reserves, but it will also free up space, especially for the most vulnerable members, that they can use in responding to this crisis. The last allocation, again, was around the time of the global financial crisis in 2009. That was in the equivalent of 250 billion. But again, this idea of our membership coming together in a spirit of multilateralism when we're faced with these sort of extraordinary crises. I will also turn very briefly to the second issue of just policy advice we've provided in response to the crisis. The first area of our policy advice, as you would expect, has been focused on managing and hopefully helping members to respond to this crisis. We've been calling on countries that can do it to maintain targeted fiscal support. We've been also very clear on the benefits of continuing monetary policy accommodation while monitoring financial stability risks, combined with careful communication, of course, to prevent excess financial volatility. Most recently, we've made a very important point that vaccine policy is now a truly important economic policy. That's a message we have been stressing, and it came out very clear in our spring meetings last week, because it's clear that unless we can ramp up vaccine production, ensure fair distribution, we're not going to see the sort of impact on global growth that can result. Our research shows that you could lift global growth by a full percentage point in 2022 if we were to get it right in how we handle vaccines. Again, that's not the IMF's role to do the distribution, but certainly to outline these significant economic effects. And they will more than pay for itself, because the increased tax revenues from sort of going back to normal sooner rather than later would be in excess of $1 trillion, according to our research. A second area of policy advice has focused on the need to guard recovery. And so here we've been talking about, as things begin to turn up, and depending on country circumstances, the need for member countries to shift focus, to begin focusing on corporate bankruptcies, on dealing with zombie firms, on addressing how you unwind some of the support that has been provided. Again, it needs to be done thoughtfully and carefully, but that's one of the areas we're now going to be looking at more fully. Issues around the design of corporate insolvency frameworks, out-of-court mechanisms, expedited mechanisms, all of that will now be coming to the fore. We're also, from the very beginning, have been looking at issues of sovereign debt vulnerabilities. We provided a number of areas of advice there, but also a number of changes to the IMF's own policy in that area. I'm happy to talk about that later. One very important area I also mentioned relates to governance and transparency and anti-corruption. Again, we've been providing all of this very rapid financing, and we've done it quickly, but we haven't wanted governance and transparency to take a back seat. So even though, as I mentioned earlier, this is outright disbursements that we just gave, we have had member countries make commitments around transparency and accountability. Things like producing audits of all of that spending, publishing procurement contracts, being very transparent about the beneficial owners of companies that are awarded procurement contracts, having special budget lines to monitor that spending. And again, countries are doing that, they are delivering. It's still early days, but it's certainly something we'll be very much following up on with respect to our membership. And maybe the last thing I mentioned is just capacity development. We think of the IMF as a lending institution, but of course, a very important part of what we do that matters quite a bit for our most vulnerable member countries is helping them to build capacity, frameworks, but also institutions. And we've been very busy at that, despite the crisis. Many time zones away from Washington, many countries are, but we've been doing this virtually for the most part. and we've provided more than 2,700 virtual capacity development engagements with 160 of our member countries over this last year since March. And again, it's been huge in terms of just helping countries navigate. So I'll stop there. As I said at the top, there's a lot more we could talk about, but I thought I would confine myself to these, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. Thank you.
No, not at all. I could have listened to that the rest of the day. That is an incredible list of accomplishments this last year. And I have to wonder how much worse the world would be had it not been for the IMF's interventions during this last year. So thank you. And the prospect of raising the capacity to lend by $650 billion, is incredibly heartening, and certainly a key part of the solution as we move forward. So thank you very much. I wanted to turn to Stephen Solomon of the WHO to ask the same question. So, we see the importance of the WHO, and so tell us a little bit about the interventions and the ways that we've been able to help in the crisis through an international organization.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here, especially among such a distinguished panel. Really is very much an honor, and looking forward to the discussion, and have already learned a lot. So thank you for that. Maybe I'll start out very briefly with a little bit of who I am and where I come from, just in 20 seconds. I'm the head of the unit dealing with international constitutional and global health law here in the World Health Organization in the headquarters in Geneva. Prior to that, I was with the US government. I was a legal advisor at the US State Department for 15 years, working on political military affairs, and particularly focusing on multilateral treaties like the Ottawa Convention, the Convention on Conventional Weapons, and the Rome Statute. And I should say that I am a graduate of Georgetown Law and loved my time there. I actually liked my first year of law school. So I teach
in the first year, so I'm very, very happy to hear that. I hope my students are watching and loving it as well.
Good. All right. Well, we're happy in some other time to talk about that as well. But very, very fond memories of Georgetown. I was on a competing law journal, the Law and Policy in International Business. So I have a little issue with your journal, but it's okay. I think I'm over it. Anyway, about WHO. We were at a very interesting, I say we because with one of your panelists, we were at a discussion yesterday and we heard a presentation by Professor Gianluca Berci on the role of international organizations, and citing Professor Ian Hurd with a 3-part description of what IOs are. And I thought it was very apt, and it's very apt for what we're talking about in terms of their evolving role, particularly in COVID-19. This 3-part structure for the role is: 1, they are actors on the international plane; 2, they are a forum for multilateral discussions, diplomacy; and 3, they are a political resource. And here I think he means a political resource in the sense of the legitimacy and impartiality that they provide to states working together. And I think WHO throughout this response has been exercising its role in all 3 ways, certainly as actors and certainly operationally, much more than we did so, for example, in the Ebola response, where we were criticized for our focus more on the normative and technical work. Since that, we built a program for health emergencies, which has much more of an operational focus, which was timely in the sense that that became so much a part of what we were doing. And I think our role has evolved even further during this crisis with respect especially to outreach to individuals. As many of you know, the Director General and his senior staff engage in twice weekly press conferences, as well as use a host of social media outlets to reach not only the media, but individuals. I think this is a new and important and evolving feature of the involvement of the public in the work of international organizations. And I think we're going to see, significant benefits, particularly for public health, with that kind of engagement. I think, I'm sure your time is limited, so I'll get to what may be in terms of the role, its role as a forum and a political resource under those second and third aspects identified by Professor Hurd for WHO. And probably that's best illustrated with the work very recently underway to develop a consensus to build a treaty on pandemics. There was a call for this by President Charles Michel of the European Council, as well as the heads of state of Chile and Tunisia originally. That was recently followed by a remarkable op-ed signed by 26 heads of state calling for a pandemic treaty. This is not the typical way that global treaties get started, with a public call in an op-ed. But what this is now leading to is the consideration of operationalizing that call with a mandate at the Health Assembly, which takes place next month, a mandate to begin international negotiations, intergovernmental negotiations, with the objective of concluding a treaty in very short order. It's been called ambitious, but the idea is to have a treaty within a year, adopted in 2022. The concern here is to take advantage of political will. The political will is obviously very great now, but like a puddle on a summer's day, as we move to the end of this pandemic, I say if because we are very much in it. But if and as we move to the end of that political will evaporate very quickly. And the need to address what has been really the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 on every aspect of our lives, certainly on our health in the definition of health within the WHO Constitution, our physical, mental, and social well-being, has been beyond, I think, what anyone would have anticipated, certainly beyond what the framers of the international health regulations were anticipating in 2005 when they built the IHRs to address the issue of epidemics and pandemics. I'm happy to talk about the treaty. There are many, many questions in this area. Why a treaty? Why not a declaration? Why should it be WHO? What would the treaty be about? How would it interact with the other legally binding international norm in this area, the international health regulations? What is the position of the US with this, which the US did not join that group of 26 states which signed the op-ed, and what is next with this? How would exactly would this unfold? So and there may be many other questions. So as well as the more sort of normative institutional questions about how does this work with WHO's constitution and why WHO's constitution is such a unique instrument for the development of this kind of an arrangement. I'll stop there because I want to be guided by you and your panel and the purposes of your meeting in how we discuss this, and very much looking forward to hearing from others and the ongoing discussions here. Thank you.
So Steve, I'm going to come back to you on this treaty. So I want to hear more. And can I also say for the students in the room, I hope that they are thinking about this treaty as a possible note topic. You have raised a lot of important legal questions about the structure of the international effort. And how exactly that should be, the kind of the critical questions about how that should be, in what forum it should be, considered, et cetera. And I want to come back to those questions. I can't imagine this pandemic again, as I said to Ms. Weeks-Brown, I can't imagine the pandemic without the role of the WHO as the critical voice of science and reason that adds, as you mentioned, the legitimacy to governments, and we've seen a lot of distrust of fellow governments in this process, and so having a more objective, trusted kind of international organization has been a critical part of the way that we've gone about this. And I also just think that it's rare that the advice of an international organization becomes something that an individual person across the world might listen to. What is the WHO saying on this? And how should I comport myself? And that kind of, the direct, relationship between the WHO's pronouncements and individual conduct is pretty unusual, to say the least. Most IOs operate through governments, and and the relationships there. And so
this is a very important and a novel, important and evolving feature, particularly for WHO, particularly in this context. But I'm sure it's there are aspects for many other IOs as well in this space.
Yeah. And so, governments may not trust each other, but people may not trust governments either. So this is also a kind of interesting relationship that we've seen over the last year. Mr. Ahmed, I wanted to turn to you and the Center for Global Development, which has been such an incredible voice and think tank in this process. And so talk about what you've seen and learned about the role of IOs from your own perspective as president of this incredible institution.
Thank you very much, Anupam. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to see some old friends on the same panel. Very nice to see you, Rhoda, and to meet new colleagues. Let me step back a little bit, because I don't work for any particular international institution now, although as was said in the introduction, I spent a lot of my life working for them. And I tried to reflect on the basis of last year, think about what did they do well, the international organizations? And then maybe in the next round, we can come back to what lessons there are for what they could have done better, or where there are shortcomings in our system. And I want to say, pick up on 3 points at this stage. But before that, I want to make a sort of more general point, which is when we say international organization, we really need to think through what kind of bodies we're talking about. Because international organization is a very diverse group of agencies. So you have WHO, you have the UN system, you have the IMF, the World Bank. So these are all sort of intergovernmental organizations that are established through some fairly strong legal foundations that are binding. But then, if you look at over the last 20 years, we've created a lot of international organizations that are very active, that have been very active in this field, which are much less formal in their structure. So think about things like, Gavi, the Global Fund. Think about, most recently, the ACT Accelerator. The ACT Accelerator is the access to COVID tools. It's a collaboration, which is what has then set up COVAX, the facility that is being used to do multilateral purchase of vaccines and then distribute them to poorer countries. These organizations are very different. They are much more, not necessarily intergovernmental. They bring in other bodies, they bring in philanthropies, sometimes they bring in the private sector, and their governance is different. And they are often, I would argue, they were created because the problem at hand was not seen as being one that the existing, more traditional international organizations were nimble enough to solve. So they were a response to what was seen as a gap in what was being done. And so people got together and said, we need to do something. We need to create a new institution. And we can have a separate conversation about the pros and cons of having too many institutions and the coordination burden that imposes. But we need to start from the reality that people think of international organizations very differently, depending on which one you're looking at. Now, let me turn to the more traditional ones and make 3 points very quickly. The first one, I think, is just to pick up on the point that both Rhoda and Stephen did, which is I think they did a pretty good job in terms of acting faster, more assertively. In the case of lending organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, they stepped up their contribution, financial contribution. They were more innovative in finding ways to do it more quickly. So I would say pretty good marks for that in terms of being able to do more of that. The second thing that they did, which was also an important role, and it sort of fits in a little bit into this, Stephen, your typology that you were referring to. I would say they were very good at being a voice for raising issues to the top. And there it was very much dependent on the leadership of the organizations in a way. And that's where I think, leadership does matter. So for example, in the case of the IMF, 10 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine the head of the IMF, which was seen as a very conservative, fiscally prudent organization, saying to its members, my advice to you is spend what you can and then spend a little more. That is not what you would have expected to come from the IMF, or for the IMF to say vaccine policy is economic policy. I think that's an important message. Or for the World Bank to have played such a big role, for example, in terms of saying we need to do something about the debt burden of countries and we need more transparency in debt, which I think the president of the World Bank has been very active in sort of talking about having more transparency in debt. So I think the voice role is important because it helps to shape the narrative globally, but it also gives individual country leaders, I don't want to use the term permission, but in a way, validation for what they would like to do, because they can point to the sort of framing that comes from the international organization. But then I want to then make my third point, and this is going to be a little bit of a segue into the next round also, is that they're really only as strong or as effective as their shareholders or members want them to be, and how much trust they have in them. So, the IMF, for example, has just come through with, or about to come through with this SDR increase, $650 billion. It's very useful liquidity for countries. There are pros and cons of how much it helps poor countries directly, but personally, I think it's a great thing. But it's happening in the spring of 2021, a year after this pandemic started. We've kind of lost 2020 in terms of the size of the response, and notwithstanding the sort of impressive numbers that Rhoda put out, which are all absolutely valid. The size of the gap that the IMF itself has estimated for emerging markets and low-income countries on financing is multiples, many times what the international financial institutions were able to put out last year. So the fact is that, the $650 billion would have been a lot better a few months ago. Why wasn't it there? Mainly because the United States government at the time was not supportive of that idea. And the United States is a big shareholder of the IMF, and without the support of the US administration, the IMF couldn't really move forward. And so now the US administration is supportive. Great news for the world. We're able to move forward. Similarly, take the case of WHO. WHO is woefully underfunded historically in terms of its structure from the assessed contribution, which is, if you like, the regular funding of the WHO's budget from its member countries. And most of the funding that it gets, and Stephen will have the exact numbers, but most of the funding that it gets for its spending is actually based on voluntary contributions rather than on its core funding, if you like. And that kind of limits its ability to do all the things that it needs to do. So we get into this vicious circle where people sort of say WHO doesn't quite deliver on some of the things we wanted to deliver, and yet we don't really equip it in terms of funding or governance to be able to do that. And so it's a question of, shareholders have to be the drivers of these institutions. And I want to end on that point by saying that, there are a couple of issues which these and other institutions have put on the table, which need to be resolved. Debt being one. So basically, if you look at debt, we have the debt of poor countries. We have a situation where essentially what we've done is for the poorest countries, about 40 of them actually, last year, they were given a opportunity to defer payment of part of the debt service that they owed, in this case to official creditors, for a couple of years. So they got $5 billion extra in liquidity as a result of that. That's good. Of course, some of them have debts that are so large that just deferring the debt service by a year or two isn't going to solve the problem. You need to deal with it more fundamentally, and it's taking a lot longer to build consensus on how to deal with those issues, not because there is a shortage of good analytical work in the institutions that are charged with coming up with technical solutions, but because there is not yet a consensus amongst the shareholders to be able to move forward. And let me end by just saying the one big issue today, we're a year into this pandemic, right? So a year and a month. We kind of see recovery happening relatively quickly in the rich countries by and large, not all of them, US particularly, China growing quite a lot, India, depending a little bit on what happens in the second surge. But we don't really today have an operational, costed, and financed plan to vaccinate the majority of the world's population by a certain date, where you could say, I can say to you confidently that here is a proposal that if we then follow through step by step, this is what each country will need to do, this is what the institutions will need to do, this is what we need to do to get the vaccines to the people along with the other tools. And by the end of 2022 or the middle of 2023 or the end of 2023, we will have sorted out this particular pandemic. That plan does not exist today. And I think it is extraordinary that a year and a bit into the worst pandemic that we have experienced in a long time, into the worst economic crisis that we have experienced in 70 years, we still do not have a plan. And the reason we don't have a plan is because we don't have an international organization or any body that is accountable and responsible for this role that the rest of the system is willing to support and trust. So WHO could very well be the place or not. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that the organizations will only be as effective and as strong as the shareholders want them to be. So let me stop with that. Thank you.
That is a really important caution in all this. And so I appreciate that. Masood. Let me turn to Professor Ayal Benvenisti of Cambridge University. You've been watching international organizations for decades now, and what are some of the things that hearten you about and so Masood turned to some of the concerns already, and so we'll shift to that as well. So he segued into that question already, but let's kind of say a little bit about what you think you've seen that has made you feel and recognize the importance of IOs in this crisis, and so I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you in this important discussion. It is a real honor and pleasure for me to take part in it. So I would like to point out four points. First, one, I think a major success was the continuous commitment to share information and to form a venue for scientific exchange of information. And I will emphasize a second point, which I think is extremely important and potentially showing the way forward to some extent, which is the decision, I think, by the WHO to start addressing people, people like you and me, individuals, through social media, through Twitter, Facebook, etc. Dr. Tedros approaching people, telling them you should wear a mask, you should keep social distance, you should take cautious and don't listen to other views. And I think this is extremely important in this day and age with all this information around. And you can think about it as a form of a direct global governance through information. I think this was an extremely important decision by the WHO. The third point that I could notice was an increased commitment by international lawyers. I'm an international lawyer, so you see international lawyers, scholars seeking to recast or rethink the international law of global health governance. And so there is a commission of the Institut de Droit International, a body of which I'm a member, that sought to conceive of new rules about states' obligations. And I think what is particularly important was the commitment to solidarity. So the idea that solidarity is part of states' obligations. So sovereignty means you have to be a good sovereign, a good citizen. In the word of another Georgetown professor, David Luban, the idea of responsibility to humanity. I think this is something that you could see developing. And I think it's going to be important for example, for decision makers, for judges, when they interpret the new international commitments of states. And fourthly, and finally, I think the understanding, I think this is important, despite everything, the understanding that the WHO is still the venue for making a change. We've heard earlier about the idea of a new treaty, that the WHO will be the venue for negotiating it. So the idea that multilateralism is essential, we can't do without multilateralism. We need to reform, but there is no reform that does not include international organizations. These are, I think, the 4 points that I take from for the last year. Thank you.
Wonderful, Professor Benvenisti. The point about solidarity and is really very important. And as a person who does technology and law, I think the interventions directly by the WHO to speak to individual people, the man on the street in Dhaka, the woman on the street in Rio de Janeiro, I think that is a very, very heartening and critical role, because as you're saying, it is as a way to respond to the disinformation crisis that we also face. So let me turn to, Masood Ahmed has already raised very important issues about the limitations. So Rhoda, Masood told us about the fact that, it's incredible, the interventions of the IMF, but one of the things we saw is that there wasn't direct support from all the shareholders, all the stakeholders, the shareholders. I should say not the stakeholders, the shareholders at the key moments that one might have wanted for more aggressive intervention. So the question I'm going to turn to all of the panelists now is, where you found the deficiencies and where, what steps are being taken to redress those. And we've already begun talking about them, but I'm going to begin with you, Rhoda.
Thanks, Anupam, and this is a great discussion. I mean, I think Masood is of course correct. Masood is always correct. And we miss you, Masood. But we're international organizations. We're creatures of international law. What we do is sort of carefully specified, albeit with some flexibility. I'll talk about that later, but in our governing documents. And so we can only do those things and using the governance structures that are provided for. But having said that, however, I would say, and maybe it's because I'm just such a natural optimist, but it's also because it's supported by, I think, our history on this. In the case of the IMF, at least, our shareholders have a remarkable record of usually coming together to deliver these kinds of things when we need to do it. And it doesn't always happen immediately, and sometimes it takes some time. In the case of this SDR allocation, sure, it would have been good to have last year, but it's still powerful and meaningful to have even today. And those gaps that Masood talked about, some of those are gaps we're projecting for the next many years in our financing, in what low-income countries will need to respond to the pandemic and in that immediate post-pandemic period. And we're working on that in separate work streams at the IMF to increase our own financing, but also to look at what others in the community have to deliver. Ultimately, we are not the only game in town, but we'll be working with other partners, but certainly playing our role. So I'm saying we have multiple avenues to address these issues, and we have multiple tools to work on them. But I do think our shareholders come together, and that's why I was comparing a lot of what's happening now with what happened in the GFC. You have these big moments when they come together. And if you think about it, in some ways, it's pretty amazing that an institution like the IMF exists. In the one hand, if we didn't exist, I think we would want to create it, but the sort of sovereignty that our member countries sort of bestowed on this institution, albeit, carefully circumscribed by the Articles of Agreement, is quite impressive. And I think they do come back to that and support when we need these things. I would say, just in terms of the weaknesses, the sort of what works and what doesn't work, I think the strength of international organizations is to have a core mandate that is clear and specific. Again, that's what the membership will need, but has enough flexibility so we can adjust and adapt as circumstances change. And again, in that sense, I think the IMF's Articles of Agreement and the body of rules that we've adopted under that give us that flexibility. And so that's why we're able to do all the things we're able to do in this crisis. And we didn't have to amend the articles. We didn't have to mix things up. We had a very strong ground for doing it. I think, and it applies not just in crisis response, but to all of our ways of operating. One of the big things we do, people think of the IMF as only a lending institution, but we do surveillance, annual Article 4 consultations with our membership. The standard for that is we can discuss topics with our members and give them strong policy advice. If the particular policy has if in our routine surveillance is whether the particular policy can significantly influence present or prospective balance of payments and domestic stability for a particular member country. Very esoteric, very arcane, but that gives us the flexibility to address a wide range of policies. In the initial days, we'll only address monetary and fiscal policies, financial sector policies. If you've read recent Article 4 reports of the IMF over the last 10 years or so, we're now discussing gender and inequality and corruption and a whole range of other topics, because the macroeconomic sort of implications of getting it right on those policies are so important. So I give that as just an example, and it's the same with our lending mandate and with a lot of the other things that we do. For me, I wouldn't say talk about weaknesses as such, but I think there are areas in which all of many international organizations can continue to improve. One that I'll mention relates to the representativeness of those institutions. For the fund, we're a quota-based institution. Quotas, we call them quotas, even though everyone calls them shares, but they're quotas that countries have in the IMF. They're the building blocks of our financial and our governance structure. A member's quota is supposed to broadly reflect their weight in the world's economy. Our 15th review of quota was completed in February of 2020 without any change in quotas, but now we're in the middle of the 16th review. We have guidance from our board of governors as to what we're supposed to be doing in the process of the 16th review. It's slated to end in December 2023. But this idea, and this is reflected in the board of governors guidance, that this quota review would be expected to result in increases in the shares of dynamic economies relative to the position in the world economy, and likely to result in an increase in the shares of emerging markets and developing countries as a whole, while protecting the voice and the representation of the poorest members. That's something that we'll be working on. It remains on the agenda, but I think that's an important issue for international organizations in general to continue to remain relevant and to fully reflect the membership. A second really important thing, and I think this touches a little bit on the point that Eyal had made earlier, but it's this idea of communicating and talking to people and explaining what we do and why we do it. I think we need to continue to make the case to build understanding and support for what each of our individual organizations do. It's not only our relationships with our member countries, but it's also explaining to people in those member countries what we do and how it makes a difference in their lives. It's a bit more difficult for the IMF, whose remit is balance of payment stability and exchange rate stability and the kinds of things that normal people sort of glaze over, but we can translate those very technical concepts into why it matters for that woman in Monrovia, Liberia, my own country, or for that child in a big city somewhere in Southeast Asia. And I think we certainly at the IMF have gotten better at it over the years. This idea of explaining what we do, this idea of the WHO speaking directly to people, I think is a good example of that. We do that ourselves by engaging with civil society, labor unions, academics, parliamentarians. We try to do that in every country that we're in. And again, it's not just about communicating for the sake of it, but again, it's really to build understanding, support, and traction for what we're doing. And I think that that has its own effects in potentially changing the minds of even the governments in these countries, because again, it's they themselves are influenced by citizens and by these sort of actors in individual countries. So I think it's something we can do more of. But again, even though, as I said, at the fund, I think we have an excellent communications department that does an amazing job, as you would have seen if you followed IMF communications. And more generally, I think we need to just continue making the case for multilateralism. Like I said, I think this pandemic has brought that home, but there are still areas where we need to continue making that case, and I think that's something we should all remain focused on. So I'll stop there. I don't know if that was sufficiently a focus on weaknesses, but I do think these are areas we can continue to.
I'm just imagining IMF TikToks done by teenagers explaining SDRs. I think that would be a huge service to the world.
We don't have a TikTok, but actually it's funny you mentioned that, Anupam, because we do have a little fact sheet. We're told, explain SDRs to how would you explain it to your mother? So we've tried to do that in that fact sheet. Please look at it and tell me if, my mom sort of knows enough about these things because I talked to her about it, but see if the average mom would understand. But that's exactly right. Reducing it to a TikTok video would be even better.
I think, yeah.
Now, if you could put that in the chat, that would be great. If you could put the link in the chat. There's a lot of people around here I'd like to send it to.
Okay, let me see if I'm technologically challenged, but maybe a colleague of mine can do that.
At any time.
We'll do.
I am going to encourage the audience to start submitting questions. We have, so we conclude at 11:15. So we will have plenty of time to entertain questions. And so you don't get opportunities to ask such leading figures questions directly very much. So let me turn then to Masood. Well, actually, let me turn to Stephen first. Stephen, can you pick up on, you talked already about the need for a pandemic treaty. And let's turn to that because, there will be future pandemics. So we have to respond to now. And I think, everyone is working very hard on now, but we also have to prepare for the future. And as you said, can I just say that I've never heard of a treaty being done in 1 year? That seems like a crazy timetable, but I totally understand your suggestion, which is that there is a momentum right now. There's the political will right now, and we need to take advantage of that political will before it dissipates. And people are focused on the crisis du jour, which may not involve health at the time. And so I appreciate that. So tell us a little bit about why at the WHO, Masood already told us, look, there are new kind of more agile, perhaps, international entities that aren't exactly typical intergovernmental organizations that have been intervening in important ways. Why do it through the WHO framework? And tell us a little bit about that framework and what that brings us and how we might, what it involves. I mean, we know how a constitutional convention is done in the United States and an amendment is done, but so just practically speaking, what would it take to get to that point? And Masood already raised the question of you need your shareholders, and WHO doesn't have exactly shareholders, but there is this question of the political will, which you've already raised. So let me turn it over to you.
Well, we have our 194 member states, thank you for the question. And maybe I could also segue from the question Rhoda was looking at, what are the gaps, what are the weaknesses to that? Because the treaty is really designed to address a major weakness. The weakness I see as human attention span. I think there are two very important questions when you're working in the area of health. With respect to attention span, not so much when you're working in the area of money like IMF. Money will always get people's attention, but health, when it's good, people don't think about. When it's bad, it's all they think about. And we've seen that in a degree that is of historic proportions with the COVID. But I think there are two questions put in very practical way. How do you stay at the top of the political inbox? Second question, how do you get to the inbox at the political top? So, and the treaty is an answer, and I think a very important answer to both of those questions, because there have been so many resolutions and statements and G7 and G20 declarations and everything on pandemic response and preparedness over the years, and we have still seen a major problem in the countries understanding how they are supposed to relate to each other during a pandemic of this scale. And I see it as with all of this, people often ask me, but isn't all of this just so much words on paper? Whether it's a resolution of the Health Assembly or a treaty, isn't it words on paper? The answer is yes, but it matters what kind of paper it is. And I use a sort of a Post-it note analogy. A resolution is like a Post-it note on the global refrigerator. And all of us who use Post-it notes know that after a little while, that glue on the back doesn't work so well. They tend to drop off. A treaty, on the other hand, is like a Post-it note with super glue on it to the global refrigerator. So it helps you stay at the top of that inbox. And when it's a treaty, because it has to go through national parliaments, because it has to engage all of governments, because it's not just the Ministry of Health negotiating, it's the foreign ministries, it's the ministries of justice and the ministries of customs and finance that come in and negotiate. And WHO has brought all of these partners in for binding instruments. The protocol on illicit trade in tobacco products is the most recent example of where we did that. Because you bring this all of government approach, you bring it to the inbox at the very political top. And the idea of a framework convention is a way of keeping at the top of the inbox. And you keep at the top of the inbox with a framework convention because the very idea of a framework is you set high-level goals and aspirations where you can get relatively quick agreement, which is in answer to your question, with the idea, the specific intention that you will fill in the details, whether it's through protocols or guidelines or whatever, over time. And there is a meta aspect to that very process. That meta aspect is the confidence, trust building, and familiarity building aspect of creating communities, both within governments and with the private sector, public sector, civil society, that are all invested in the objectives of the treaty. And we've seen that in many areas. We've seen it in climate. We've seen it in landmines. We've seen it in tobacco, where this soft and hard institution building that results from framework conventions is not something you have to get through. It's actually a very important part of the process to establish that confidence and trust, because after all, these are communities of people who work. And even when they come to this with different agendas, private sector, civil society will have different agendas. The IOs themselves will have different agendas. That's fine. The process of working out accommodations and finding a common course is itself extremely important, especially in times of crisis, because that's when you need that level of trust and familiarity so that people can reach out to other individuals based on an established relationship. So this is the idea of in a larger sense of a framework convention. The actual process is an intergovernmental negotiating body gets agreed. You establish chairs to lead that process. You, in this case, have to engage a whole of society approach. You have to look upstream from the international health regulations, which don't look upstream. And I think Professor Benvenisti has spoken eloquently about this idea of looking at the zoonotic issues, at the issues of spillover effect, of food supply, and how we do that, the north-south differences on this issue. All of these things have to be brought in. So it's a whole of society, whole of spectrum approach to pandemic risk and pandemic response. And it really takes a treaty to do that. And only a treaty can resolve issues that bear on areas already subject to international law and treaty regulation. And here I'm talking about issues like access and benefit sharing, regulated under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. You're going to need a treaty to deal with that issue. You have to have an equitable way to share the benefits from the viruses that are absolutely essential if we're to find countermeasures and diagnostics. But if you don't provide for the benefits that are derived from those samples and from that genetic material, then you're not going to have a system where people want to contribute into those viruses. So it's really just a matter of enlightened self-interest that we have an arrangement, but there's already international law here. Over 120 countries are party to the Nagoya Protocol. You're going to have to do that in an international legal context. You're going to have to deal with the issues, as I mentioned, of zoonotic risk here. You're going to have to deal with issues linking to biodiversity, trade in endangered species, those kinds of issues. You're going to have to deal with sustained funding. That's going to be, I think, easier and more sustainable in a treaty context. You, I think, are going to have to deal, although this is a tough one, on issues of compliance and monitoring. And it's hard to do that in a political declaration. And I think you're going to have to deal with, I think it's very important and essential, actually, to deal with issues of human rights, privacy protection, particularly in light of a very dynamic, evolving technology situation. Big data, artificial intelligence, digitalization. We're seeing just the tip of the iceberg on the issue of digitalization of vaccine passports. This is only going to get profoundly more complicated over the coming years. And so a treaty, particularly framework convention, can provide a form of future proofing. So hopefully the humans can keep up with the machines as we evolve. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I think this is, if this gets off the ground, this initiative for a treaty, it would, I should mention this, only be the second time WHO has used this authority to establish conventions. The first one was the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But I think it is it's an inflection point that we are in of historic proportions, equivalent to post-World War I, post-World War II inflection points. Post-World War I, the global community had difficulty getting its act together. We sort of retrenched to more nationalistic impulses. Post-World War II did a much better job of that, really invested in multilateral solutions. That's really where the modern international organizations get their greatest strength from. The WHO Constitution, it was 1946, remarkable document. All your students, I recommend, just read the preamble, if nothing else. If you want a source of inspiration and you want to deal with feeling jaded, just read the preamble to the WHO Constitution. It's extraordinary. So I'll stop there. Also, I've joined the group, Rhoda, the incurable optimists. So it's just easier than being a pessimist, I think.
So I think that's wonderful to be an incurable optimist, and I think that is, keeps us going in these times, certainly. Masood, you're also a realist, and so an optimist and a realist. So tell us a little bit about the weaknesses that you've observed. You began by describing some of the lack of political will, and Stephen is trying to capitalize on an immediate crisis and reminding us of the political will in the wake of World War II. And so, what are the weaknesses, and what's the steps that we should be taking?
I first of all want to say that I think I just want to emphasize the point that Rhoda and Stephen have made, because I think they've raised really important examples of how the organizations have been creative and responsive, even within the constraints that their mandates and basic articles impose on their activity. And actually having those foundations gives them strength to be able to act as well. So I want to kind of just reinforce that point. I think maybe I want to just pick 2 points that are not so much on weaknesses of the organization, but the challenge ahead, given the nature of the world in which we now live compared to 1946. I think that to me is the sort of fundamental issue in a way, because that was an exceptional moment. And right now we're also at a bit of an inflection point, not just because of COVID, although I think COVID has reinforced it. There are 2 big framing factors that we need to consider as we move forward for the role of international organizations. The one is a growing, now quite widespread sense of skepticism amongst many population groups, and therefore amongst their political leaders around the world, on whether globalization has worked for them and whether they have been left behind in some ways. And so you see varying degrees of populist responses around the world to that. I don't want to overplay this, but what it does mean is that the multilateral institutions have to stop being identified with being cheerleaders for globalization to actually being what they were intended to be, which were the institutions that would help to put order into global flows. So the role of the IMF and of the World Bank and WHO is actually to provide a framework within which trade, the movement of intellectual property rights, the common rules and norms can be defined that will help to manage and control the globalization. And I think there was a period, probably 10, 20 years towards the end of the last century, beginning of this, when their narrative became so pro-globalization that they became identified as promoting globalization at the expense of the lives of ordinary people, rather than as being the forces, actually, the institutions that were created to put order around globalization. So I think there's a little bit of a selling job that all of the institutions have to do to make a better case. And I think Rhoda was sort of explaining how the IMF is doing that. I'm a big fan of the IMF's communications department, but I think they're doing trying to get out and explain why what they do is actually of help to ordinary folk around the world in terms of their daily lives. And then what Stephen was talking about, the same thing. And the second framing fact, I think, is geopolitical rivalry. So think about, the US-China relationship is now probably more tense, and the way people think about China's role in the global system is probably different from the way people thought about it 10 or 20 years ago, if you talk to many people who are in the US. And maybe to some degree in Europe also there's the case. And so, I'm not taking a view on whether this is right or wrong, or I'm just saying, to the extent there is this tension, that means that the notion, the feasibility of coming together to agree on a treaty, to take Stephen's example, on even on a topic so current and so vital as pandemic preparedness and prevention and response, becomes much harder than in a moment when there is less of a sense of this geopolitical competition. And so we just have to factor that in. And so I guess the lesson of the second framing fact for me as we think for the future is, what's the right balance between trying to base future international cooperation on the kinds of firm foundations that are the basic business model of the organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the WHO and the UN, which are all set up after the war, and how much of it is going to come around sort of more informal, pragmatic coalitions to solve common problems without necessarily having the same legal structure. Now, I'm very conscious that I'm speaking at a law school, and this is all, everybody else on this panel is a lawyer. So I don't want to minimize the risk of what I'm saying, but I do think we should think about what is the way forward that is likely to deliver better outcomes for people 20 years from now. So, if you're looking at improving people's lives over the next generation, which path is more likely to get us to that outcome? And I'm just kind of conscious of the fact that over the last 2 decades, with the notable exception that Stephen mentioned about tobacco, much of what has been created without the kind of initial treaty or convention-based structures which create the strongest institutions and the ones that are the most binding on all their members. But precisely for that reason, members are not so keen to create them going forward now. So maybe the answer is just think through what would be the way in which we could introduce some of the binding virtues of the more formal organizations into structures that are less formal in their design. And I think that's a challenge for not just the people on this panel, but actually also all the students who might be watching this. If you're a law student, it'd be an interesting question. How can you mimic a formal treaty-based, convention-based kind of organizations, roles and structures and constraints and mandate without having to go through the process of getting agreement on the treaty itself. So I think that's I just like to pose those two challenges, if you like, or two factors as we think about the future.
Thank you, Masood, for raising important questions for us lawyers. And I think most of the audience is lawyers, so you're absolutely right to provoke us in this way and to ask us these critical challenges. Luckily, I'm confident that Georgetown law students, like Stephen, 20 years from now, will be helping solve these problems. And so I am an incurable optimist, like because of our students. Let me turn to Ayal and Cambridge law students, of course, as well, Ayal. So tell us what your views are about the weaknesses and the ways forward.
Thank you. I'll be brief to allow time for students' comments. And again, 4 points. And I don't have much to add because the previous speakers already laid out all the problems and the challenges. So I think the WHO was designed with the idea that, or the assumption that everybody is willing to just to promote a good health. So there's a shared interest, and we need scientists, epidemiologists to lead us the way, and all of us will follow. This is what I read from the WHO Constitution, and I agree. This is really an inspirational document. But it turns out that there are endemic conflict of interests between states, how to allocate the costs of preventing risks and how to allocate the benefits, health benefits. So this is the second point. The third point is that so far, the North has been quite successful in imposing the risk on the South without sharing benefits. So if you think about cholera in the past, and more recently about swine flu, Ebola and Zika, the immediate reaction was to cut trade, cut transnational travel, and leave the South to bear the consequences without necessarily sharing the vaccines and the treatment with them as a matter of law, as a matter of right. And now the COVID-19 brought to the North the idea that we are in the same boat, that everybody is equally vulnerable. And this may be now the impetus, will bring the impetus for change. And here I join previous speakers and the inspirational idea of a major treaty and the idea that we are in fact in a post-World War point, and we should regard it in this way and try to find a comprehensive solution. But here's the problem. A comprehensive solution means that in all spheres of life, states will have to lose part of their discretion. The North will have to bear the consequences of its excessive demand that leads the South to push for deforestation. It's not only Brazil that is culpable of deforestation. It's also the North. It's also Europe demanding such products. So how to curb all the different efforts to prioritize our citizens, and democracies are more vulnerable to this domestic pressure. So can there be in fact a grand bargain about turning independent sovereign states into global citizens? This is a moment acknowledging the task that faces all of us. And I agree that we need to act soon, and encouraged by the fact that there are states who push for acting on this. The thing is, the challenge is so huge that we shouldn't belittle it by saying that, you know, more law will suffice. We need to ensure that this treaty has linkages with all other treaties, with the WTO treaty, with all other regimes and international organizations that have some bearing on the direct and indirect risks to health. So it's a major challenge, but you know, looking historically, 1945 was another such a moment, and the UN was, if you look back, was a success. So the thing is, we need to get into the mood of a post-World War situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eyal. So let me begin with a question from our audience. So Professor Olabisi Akinkugbe, I apologize for the pronunciation, of Dalhousie University, who's also the founder of Afroeconomics blog, which I commend to everyone, asks an important question. So the question is the idea about the pandemic treaty. Given the challenges that underpin the multilateral trading system today and vaccine nationalism challenges, are we placing too much fate on legalism? This is a question that Professor Benveniste suggested also in the tail end of his remarks. Addressing the structural inequality challenges of the global order cannot be separated from solutions we propose. How do we marry these different regimes? Professor Benveniste already discussed the linkages question, but Stephen, you know, there's a lot of trade issues, there's finance issues, along with health issues in any such treaty, and other and kind of state sovereignty issues. You know, sending people across borders, you know, when they're and et cetera, which is a critical part of this, and sharing benefits, and which again Eyal talked about. So let me turn to you, Steve, to respond to Professor Akinkugbe.
Yes, thanks for that. So are we putting too much faith on legal structures? I think the issue is sort of what's the alternative? When you're dealing with the scale and scope of the problem, and Professor Benveniste has really pointed to this issue of particularly the zoonotic risks, the spillover risks, and the north-south relationship. You need instruments to regulate and arrange the relationship among states and the many other important actors in this area. And I'll just illustrate it this way. You know, a lot of people, when they first heard about the wet markets, said, a lot of people in the North said, well, why do they eat pangolins? That seems crazy. The question could well be flipped, and should be flipped, to say, well, why do we eat so many cows and so many pigs and so many chickens that require the clear cutting and have obvious consequences for climate, but more and more clearly obvious consequences for the public health risks and the risks of spillover and zoonotic disease. So, but these are very big problems. So getting back to the legal issues, a framework convention doesn't purport to say, we're going to fix this or we're going to fix this in a year with a framework convention. What it really asks is something more modest, albeit still ambitious, which is a recognition of the issue, which would lead to addressing it in a careful and structured way. let me illustrate that point by saying, I mentioned the Protocol on Illicit Trade. The Framework Convention on Tobacco has, in its Article 6 for your law students, it has a simple reference. It's not even an obligation. It's a recognition. It's all it is a recognition. It recognizes in Article 6 that tax and price measures are an important element to address tobacco consumption. So they got agreement on that, just a recognition. And out of that grew this Protocol on Illicit Trade in Tobacco Products, which brought in ministries of justice because it has mutual legal assistance aspects. It brought in ministries of taxation. It brought in ministries of customs because it's dealing with trade in tobacco products. It brought in technology because it deals with a track and trace mechanism. So this is, I think, a very important example where a legal tool, a treaty, was used to address a very complicated problem over time following a general recognition. And then just one idea, and I'll just respond to the idea that, well, a treaty in a year, that's kind of crazy. With my favorite counterpoint to that, which is the WHO Constitution itself, less than 6 months, called for in February 1946 and adopted in July of 46. Now, very different time, obviously, but that is an extraordinary instrument. And with political will, the hope that we might be able to do something in twice the amount of time on a much narrower scale, just pandemics, given its broad reach, I think is not unreasonable. But it will require a great deal of political will and engagement, especially by civil society and the public, because that is a way to drive political will. Yesterday, we had a discussion with civil society representatives, very interested in this topic. That kind of an engagement with private sector, with many more governments, all stakeholders, which is essentially to say everyone in this issue, is very, very important.
Thank you, Stephen. So Chris Godshall, one of our students, asks the question, and Masood raised a similar observation. How can IOs remain independent, avoiding capture by the more powerful countries in times of crisis? And so concerns about the WHO and the US-China relationship. And I'm going to begin by turning to Masood to continue that discussion.
I think it's a hard question, and I don't think there is a simple answer to say this is how you do it. There are a couple of elements of it. I would say one is to have built into the system some independent unit that conducts surveillance of what countries are doing, and which is then can be presented to this intergovernmental body, but doesn't sort of engage the intergovernmental body leadership in quite the same difficult trade-offs. So in some ways you sort of create a little bit of an arm's length thing and you can put a little bit of distance between you and them, although it's a very useful function to have. The other is to have a mechanism that in a way holds those bodies to account by having some independent evaluation system. So for example, I think one of the things that I go back to my experience in the IMF, one of the things the IMF created now 20 years ago was an independent evaluation unit, which does write reports on how the IMF handled some particular issue or the other, and which sometimes make for uncomfortable reading by the staff and the management of the IMF, because this group is able to not just say these things, but then have them published, and that helps to foster a debate in civil society. And finally, I would say, organizations, a little bit of self-promotion here, organizations like ours, Center for Global Development, actually one of the big roles that we play is to be an independent voice that can push, shine a spotlight, do some analysis that would I would say not so much criticize with the simple purpose of criticizing, but encourage them to move forward. So for example, recently, we have been pushing quite hard with some analysis on how the IMF could sustain its high level of lending to poor countries, which it did last year. Rhoda mentioned that they had raised their lending to Africa, I think 13-fold, you said, Rhoda. But they used to do about $1.5 billion to $2 billion a year of lending on its concessional funds for low-income countries. And traditionally, last year it was more like 9. And our analysis says you've got to sustain that for 10 years. Now, it's easier for us to say that and explain how it can be done because we think it's doable. And it's a little harder for the IMF staff, even if they agree with that, to be able to come out and say that publicly in the same way, because in a way they're a bit constrained by their framework. So the third mechanism, in a way, of stopping the institutions from becoming captured by their shareholders is to have independent outside bodies that can also comment on the same issues. And there are a lot of people who are commenting on WHO things at the moment. Some of it is well informed, some of it is not well informed, but I think all of it is in that sense useful to foster a debate.
So, and I want to return to a point that you made in your last set of comments as well, which is that seeing international institutions not as cheerleaders of globalization, but as key kind of checks and regulators and support, and providing the institutional support needed to ensure that globalization works for the benefit of the world's people. I think that is an incredibly important observation, and if I'm characterizing what you said correctly. So let me turn to anyone else who would like to speak to these challenging questions that have been raised. Rhoda.
Yeah, no, thanks, Anupam, and great discussion. Maybe a couple of quick things just on the last point you made about the not being cheerleaders. I couldn't agree more with that. And I think it's something, if you look at what the IMF has been doing really over the last several years now, it's almost been a bit of a counterpoint to that. This idea about being sure to address people left behind and to have policies that do that effectively. Again, all the work we're doing now on issues around inequality, around gender, increasingly now also around climate, which is another big area for us, but are all sort of going very in a more granular level in some ways on the kind of policies that you need to have more inclusive and more sustainable growth, issues around health and education. And again, I'm just agreeing with that. And it goes to the broader point I made earlier, but not only do we need to not be cheerleaders, and not only do we need to sort of think through and push these policies, but we need to explain that. Because again, I think too many people are still stuck in notions of our organizations that are decades old, but we need to continue informing them. On this issue of capture, my question would be, what does capture mean? Because I think we need to unpack that a little bit. At least when I speak for the IMF, most IMF decisions are taken by complete consensus. We're a very consensus-driven institution. We do have a voting power system, but most board meetings is by consensus. If we don't have it, we sort of hesitate to go ahead. Very rarely do you have any decisions taken at the board that's not by consensus. Most of those are just a majority of the voting power, but they're very unified. We do have some very significant things that require a slightly higher voting power. 85% is the highest we require. That means that any country that controls more than 15% of the total voting power, and the US does, for example, has a say more strongly in those decisions, or any group of countries that together control more than 15. Is it capture if under the structure, those decisions maybe don't get taken because a group of countries say, we don't like that and let's have a bit more of a discussion? I don't know. But I'm saying, I think that's where we see that issue most significantly. And to call it capture. On Masood's point about staff, that's the only thing I would disagree a little bit, because I think staff isn't hesitant on these issues. We need to do a lot of analysis. We spend a lot of time debating among ourselves. We're having a big debate in the IMF right now about our low-income lending and our, how do we do it? It's always a lot more complicated than just sort of, we should lend more, because sure we can, but how do we do it? Where are our partners? How do we make sure it actually helps countries rather than hold? So I'm saying, so that's that debate right now. Once we're done with it, it's going to be published and, and it's going to be there. And I think that's how we'll continue doing these things. And again, the optimist in me things will end up at the right place and we'll have our shareholders with us. I don't have a strong view on these issues of strong versus hard law. I think if we can achieve the same effect without a treaty and without the hard law, that's fine. And as Masood and others have said, increasingly, that's where we are. But the more you try to bring in the trappings of the hard law systems, then the more sort of you're back to that sort of, it's a bit of a tension. We can't have it both. We're going to either have these voluntary flexible systems or the kinds of systems that the IMF exemplifies in many ways. But thanks again. This has been a great discussion and I've really found it super interesting.
Thank you, Rhoda. Steve.
On this issue of the sort of the rather than call it capture, the outsized influence of certain key states in the work of IOs, I can give you an example of where WHO has adjusted its election system to deal with that, and then an idea of how you could even deal with that outsized influence issue even more directly. So WHO used to elect its director general by having the 34-member executive board send one nomination to the 194-member health assembly. So the 194 got to think about one person. And interestingly, on that 34-member executive board, the P5 had special rights, informal, completely, of being represented more or less, certainly more than you would do if you just did a regular rotation of 194. So that gave some outsized influence. WHO changed that, a very positive development. One of the few organizations, and maybe others will move to this, to have a truly inclusive election of its director general by the full plenary, by all 194. Yes, the executive board does a screening process, but they can send multiple candidates. And this, by the way, was the process which elected Tedros, Dr. Tedros, as our current DG. I think that was a very important development. One possibility, I am speaking personally here, this is not, and I hope it's understood this is a personal thing, but the idea of a single longer term for a director general could further strengthen that degree of independence. And if you wanted to further even strengthen, give a really good pension after that single 7 or 8 year term, and you get even greater strengthening. So there are ways that you could address some of this. The thing is, a lot of the member states may not like these ideas because it's always a balance that they like to strike. As Professor Benvenisti was saying, the idea that countries have to be willing to give up a little of their sovereign autonomy is the reality of all international organizations from the very beginning. They do it when they see a benefit to them and they want that trade-off to always come out in their favor. But more and more, the issues we're dealing with are purely global issues. And this idea of good citizenship, which you've talked about, good global citizenship, really does mean limiting to a even greater extent that degree of autonomy which sovereign states enjoy and jealously guard, and to a way to arrange it so that they're reassured that doing so, delegating certain sovereign authorities to a group will serve their own interests is very, very important. Finding the way to make that case, to show that in each instance is going to be very important. But so I think there are ways to address this issue of areas where there are outsized influence, but it will remain an issue as long as we have also these funding issues. It's actually, it's 20%. That's all. Our assessed contributions are just 20% of our budget. We have to pass the hat for the 80%. So that's going to mean those that fill up the hat are going to have somewhat of an outsized say in how things go. It shouldn't be that way, and we're trying to work it to improve that. But financing is another big aspect.
Yeah.
So I think I don't have much to add, but just to give the metaphor of Ulysses and the sirens. Ulysses wanted to hear the sirens, so he designed a way to ensure that he will not be able to give the orders when he hears the siren song. So if governments realize that this is in the long-term interest, this is the self-interest, enlightened self-interest, as Stephen earlier said, to take away power, to curb their own authority. Just as the way we have independent courts, we could also have independent global governance, but that governance would have to be monitored, as Masood said, by outsiders, by third parties, by civil society. So there is a way if there's a will.
So I think we'll conclude here because I've run across my time limit a little bit. Thank you all for an amazing discussion. I learned a tremendous amount, and I am greatly appreciative to all the international entities, organizations, and other groups represented here for their contributions. I'm looking forward to strengthening that international order in the future. And thank you again to Christina Peck, to Diane Reisman, and the students of the Georgetown International Law Journal for a tremendous conference. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers and to Professor Chander for moderating. Yeah, thanks for that wonderful discussion. And we're just going to take a short 5-minute break now to set up for our next panel discussion. So we'll see you all shortly. Thank you.